All right, cool. Thanks, Pia, and thanks for having me. I'm from Pi. We're in Amsterdam. We do international creative work, strategy work, other types of work. I'm from the UK. I've been here for 15 years. Khatet, Alex. I am a strategist at heart, but I now run a business, so I have to sort of straddle between both, which is not actually easy because when you're trying to run a business and you're trying to be insightful, you get them mixed up. But I do, at the moment, strategy for Lego and Nike and Heineken and some sort of projects for like Patagonia. And then on the side, I do sort of like advisory work for some sort of DEI initiatives, some of them in the Netherlands, some of them abroad. And that's me, stretched, looking slim. It's good. We're known for the creative output because that's generally what people see, but we're mostly doing strategy and innovation work for brands. We even made a Pi bike, which is here. Come to our office on the Vondelpark. You can ride it. It's really good. It's quite high, so if you're short, it won't work. Not very inclusive. Sorry about that. We do cultural transformation, so that's mostly research and strategy, opening up new markets, stuff like that, upstream. We do brand stuff we all know and understand and love or hate. And then we do experience work, ecosystem work, stuff like that. But today I'm going to talk to you about a cultural project, so research and strategy project, which led to some quite interesting work. And kind of interesting to talk about how cultural research can lead to brand action, because in the end, that's the whole point, right? We publish our own research. It's cultural research, so it's speaking to cultural experts about cultural change and helping marketeers and everyone else that wants to know about change understand it so they can do something about it. It's called New Society Rules. Does what it says on the tin. This is the new one. It came out recently, Web3, giving a cultural view on Web3, because the technical view on Web3 is a bit like, we're never really sure what it is. But I'm actually going to talk to you about the first report we published back in 2020, which is called The Opening Issue. And it was actually based on research done in 2019 and the beginning of 2020. And it was all about how our online lives and how our online relationships are starting to have a greater influence over our offline lives than the other way around. So it was kind of timely, given that we did the research in 2019 and then it got launched around the pandemic. So we became quite relevant quite quickly, and that was convenient for us because we're all panicking about clients and revenue and relevance. But it also led to a really interesting project and story, which I'm going to talk about today. And that's why I referenced what Pia said about big data points and little data points, because this was a large project based on a lot of research and data, but it was inspired by someone's gut and an individual's observation. And so the way we do our research is that we recognize as a cultural focused business that most of our clients have a fuck ton of quant, right? So they rarely come to us and say we need more quant. They generally have Ipsos and Google and Kantar and coming out of their ears, and they're looking at it like this and looking like that, and they're trying to see something new. And so we can't really contribute much to that. But what we can contribute to is what's happening on the bleeding edge of culture, some of the stuff that is slightly more uncomfortable to study because it's more qualitative, and it maybe is not as tangible because it's not mass yet, and there aren't a billion data points, so you're not sure if you can trust it or not. But we sort of focus there, and so we speak to cultural experts. In our first report, we spoke to all of these different people across lots of different categories, all of which were being affected by online communities and how they were starting to influence the offline world. And so what we found was that at the time, mind-blowing insight, online relationships are making our real lives much bigger. Of course, now that's like, of course they are, because we've been locked up for 2 years and the only way to access the world is through the internet. But at the time that was like, oh, okay, and how are they making our lives bigger? Because of course, we often think about how online makes our lives smaller, in the sense of we just sort of get sucked into our phone and then we don't sort of engage with the wider world. But in fact, that's not true. And one of the most interesting things was how digital life is opening up our relationship pool. And this is most interesting when you look at it through the lens of minority communities, because if you live as a minority, then your world can feel quite limiting sometimes, because the people around you may not relate to you from a religious or racial or ability perspective, and so you might feel like you are quite lonely, whereas actually, the internet is helping people to find new relationships. And young people like this a lot because they can find people that share interest with them, and they can start to feel seen in more places than in their physical location. And it started to come to life with some of the conversations we had with some founders of sort of initiatives and communities who were trying to help different minority groups to feel seen and feel part of something bigger than their physical life could offer them. And this quote from Amalia was great. Growing up, I didn't really have that many Muslim friends. I was all searching for sisterhood. She started a Muslim girls community in the north of England, who, which seemed kind of like obvious, right? Like if you're from a Muslim community, surely you have other Muslim girls. But, being a young woman growing up in the UK, like there's a difference between being Muslim and actually having like your girlfriends who actually share your interests and are a younger generation and are from different places outside of your small town. So simple thing made a big difference for her. But another conversation we had with a guy called Phil Young, who is one of the outdoor industry's most prominent voices. He's a black guy. He was one of the original snowboarders from the 80s, like pieces of wood, strapping them to their legs, going to the Alps and sort of trying not to kill yourself, that type of vibe. And he's been in the scene for years, and he's been sort of, frankly, quietly trying to make a case for inclusion and diversity in the outdoor industry, but there's not really much of a case or an interest there. It's a small community in relative terms, and it's very much a community, like, sort of either in the outdoor world or you're not in the outdoor world. You're either a hiker or you're not a hiker. You're either a boarder or you're not a boarder, et cetera, et cetera. Like you can't just show up, and people don't really want you to mess with it because it's a passion-based culture. So you don't sort of like mess with it because everyone's like, yeah, we're all here to do this thing. Anyone can come. Everyone's welcome. But he has a whole thing about like, we're starting to see the beginnings of a little movement going on in the outdoor world where people who didn't historically feel comfortable in the outdoor sports world are starting to make their own little communities. And if you add them all together, there's something happening there. You would never spot it with the naked eye because it's so small, but he thinks there's something going on. So we did that report. The reason we interviewed Phil was because we have an African-American woman called Paris, who's one of our strategists at Pi, and she moved to Europe 2018-ish. And she was like, where she's from, the outdoor world has had this whole revolution in like East Coast US revolution. And it started with access and comfort being in national parks in the US, which historically have had some sort of racial issues around like, who feels comfortable there, how they're represented, et cetera, like that. And when she moved to Europe, she's like, you don't have any discussion about outdoors. And I was frankly like, what discussion is there to have? I don't understand. It's the outdoors. Like, there's literally couldn't be any less barriers to going to it than any other place in the world. If it was the indoors and you couldn't get in, I get it. But the outdoors, literally, leave your house, you're already there. So it was quite a difficult thing for me to understand. I grew up in Brighton, the UK. We're quite close to hills, and you just have to get on your bike or walk down to the beach. It's pretty obvious. But she's like, no, you don't get it. Like, what does it feel like to walk into a pub in England if you're brown in the countryside? And I was like, oh, that's different. That's a little bit like I'm the first one that's walked in today. Maybe why am I here? So I started to understand what she meant. What does it feel like to not have access to the, to the skills or the kit you need to do outdoor pursuits? I was like, oh yeah, that's awkward. Like outdoor sports are super technical. Like I wouldn't feel comfortable just to rock up there. Plus, if you walk into the pub and they think you look weird, I'm starting to get the picture of like, yeah, you've got a point here, Paris. And so what we did is a project called Opening Up the Outdoors. And the project was actually inspired by one of the chapters in the report we did. It was called Opening Up the Outdoors. And she did this interview with Phil Young. He talked about his view on this whole situation. And 2 years later, it's now the leading foundation for inclusivity in the outdoor industry. Let me talk to you about how that happened. So what we're doing now is we've created this foundation called Opening Up the Outdoors. It gives industry new purpose and opens up the new markets, right? Sounds kind of clever and useful and commercial and purposeful. But the way it came about was the conversation with Phil Young. Paris spoke to Phil. Phil said we should do something about inclusivity in the outdoors. She said, I agree. I'm from America. We figured that out over there. We should figure it out in Europe. And we sort of set about having this conversation. We also understood from him that why is it happening, right? So immigration into Europe, most immigrant communities end up in cities. In those cities, they end up in sort of ghettoized neighborhoods. You see it in Amsterdam and different, where are the black people? They're not in the center, they're in a specific neighborhood. Oh, okay, so you have a sort of geographical sort of like your environment. You're not really encouraged to leave that environment. You probably don't have the financial means to leave that environment and discover all those wonderful places around Holland or Europe or UK or beyond. And so that's where these things start. We also had another interview with a guy called Alex Weller. He was the marketing director of Patagonia at the time. He was talking to us about how Patagonia's done a really good job of activating the communities around them around purpose. And their purpose is the environment. And sort of they've made that pretty clear in the last few months, right? Like making a big statement about their... Yes? Yes, you agree? Yeah, 5 minutes, right, cool. I thought you were just saying yes, that's great. Yeah, fine. And so Alex explained that they figured out how to use purpose and community. So we've got one conversation over here with Phil, talking about like, hey, you know, minority communities don't really feel comfortable in the outdoors. Another conversation with Alex, who's saying, hey, you know, brands are really good. We've been really good at building communities around passion points. But that's interesting. Then we had this Black Lives Matter moment that happened just after we published a report. And so brands were sort of getting their heads into gear around diversity and inclusion and trying to figure out what to do. And we also had a strange situation where, because we were studying this whole area of the outdoors through the report we created, we saw some weird shit, like really random stuff that you would never expect to see. Like suddenly the reaction to Black Lives Matter in the US with a murder is a White Lives Matter movement in the outdoor industry. No one expected to see this. It's like, wait, what are you guys doing? What's going on? They're like, we don't want you to bring all of that Black Lives Matter drama to our countryside space. We're perfectly happy where we are. All lives matter. And it's like, no one's asking you guys, what's your point? You know, so we're starting to understand what's going on there. Like, why are people feeling the need to sort of react to something over there in the European and UK countryside? So there's obviously some racialization of space going on. So a lot of the brands, they did their black square and moved on, but we decided to act. At this point, we're still just pie. We published our report, talking to some experts, trying to understand what's going on. But the conversation led to a meeting with Patagonia, Alex at Patagonia, who said, I like what you guys are thinking and the thinking you're doing around inclusion in the outdoors. Let's do some research. So we did some research across Europe. It was really hard to do because, as I said before, the movement in outdoor inclusion is tiny. So these tiny little communities that we could hardly even find across Europe. In the UK, it was a little bit more progressed, but in places like Germany and Italy and France, it was literally like hunting down individual people who were making a tiny little bit of a noise in a tiny little community somewhere in the Alps to have a little bit of an influence around inclusion in the outdoors. You've all seen it if you've ever been skiing. You know, you see that one French black guy who's come from Paris, who's on the ski lift next to you, and you're like, oh, so, you know, we know what it looks like. But people were making really big statements like the outdoor is very much a white space. A strange idea if you've never thought about it before. Or this idea that you always have the feeling that you're incompetent. I can understand that part. If you haven't done these sports before, the idea of being in a space you haven't been comfortable with, feeling very inept, right? That you haven't got the gear for it. Finding out the gear is really expensive, so participation's actually got a high barrier of entry. You like think about the cost of a ski trip or the cost of any trip that you have to go to the Alps or anywhere exciting like that. So it's actually quite an insider's club, weirdly. And if you're actually in the outdoor industry, this isn't so strange. Like, it's very much an insider's club. Like, it's very cool, in a cool way. It's like, you know, we're like borders. Like, we fucking love this stuff, you know? Like, so there's a sort of like positive side of being an insider club, and then there's a negative side of an insider's club that people haven't really thought about before. But there's also a new generation of community leaders who are changing this. And some of these are badass. So one of them is this one here, which is Amalia. She runs the Muslim Girls Hiking Club in the UK. When I saw the imagery of her and her Muslim hiking girls near Birmingham, I think it is, going out into the, you know, to the Lake District and the Peak Districts in the UK and hiking in like hijabs, I was like, wow, I've never seen that before. Like, I've never seen like Muslim girls hike. That idea is a new idea in my head, which seems stupid because why would it be a new idea? It's just people going to the countryside. But that whole point I made about like, why is it so difficult to go in the outdoors? You have to leave your house. Suddenly when you see it in reality, you're like, yeah, no, that does look different. I haven't seen that before. I don't know why I haven't seen it. And so we also had the conversation with Patagonia because they were funding the research, which is, hey, let's get back to, you know, it's great that you want to do DEI. It's great that we want to open up the outdoors, but in the end, let's be honest, if it doesn't align with your bigger mission, you're going to get confused and it's going to get sidelined and it'll end up being a CSR initiative, right? But if we really want to open up the outdoors, we need to realign it with your North Star. Your North Star is the environment, right? We can't change that. And it's a good North Star, right? Pretty good. People like it. How about if young black and brown kids who generally live in city centres around Europe cared about the environment, and they're probably the highest spenders on sports equipment. We know that because Nike, Adidas, etc. That's their whole focus, right? If they started to care about and enjoy the outdoors, then it would open up the outdoor industry, the market, which is quite niche. It would grow the market, but it would also grow interest, like tangible interest in nature. If you ask a young black kid in London, do they care about nature? They say, yeah, of course they do. Why wouldn't I? Everyone does. We're young people. We care about nature. But if you ask them about a tangible relationship with nature, it's different. It's like, well, I don't really go into the countryside. I haven't really met any cows. And that's important, right? If you haven't got a tangible relationship with nature, you can't really care about it. It becomes just a sort of consumer idea versus an actual idea. So we made this point to them and they were like, oh, that shifts it from CSR to brand to business. And then suddenly you've got a whole initiative. So we had that nice thing that we always try and find, the purpose and profit. Coolest thing that happened. Patagonia was sitting around, we're debriefing them on the research, making strategic recommendations. They're saying clever stuff like, this is a business mandate, not a CSR mandate. We're like, oh, this is great, we're winning. And then they were like, but we can't do this alone because although we're very influential, there's no one brand in the outdoor world that's financially strong enough to actually make a change, even though we've got, a bill of revenue. So we need to get everyone involved. And this was cool for us because it's like, oh my God, this is like one of those moments where you sort of like hope this will happen in your career and you've done some research and strategy and then the client says it's important and you're like, cool, are we done now? And you sort of want to wrap it up and make a case study and they're like, no, we're just starting. And so they invited first the North Face, then Adidas, Terex, I didn't even know that existed, then Berghaus, then Arctex, and then Vio Barefoot, and then about 10 other brands to join in what became the Opening Up the Outdoors initiative. So we're like, oh, cool, it was our research piece, and now it's an initiative. Where's it going to go? So we had to wait a long time, if I'm honest. This was where it gets a bit annoying as a strategist. You're like, what are we going to do? Can we make a video? What's the outcome? And they're like, no, we're taking it seriously. It's going to be a real thing. So they took about a year to working together, which they're not familiar with doing, to make a one-page statement, which they could then give back to us and say, okay, we all agree with this. And we're like, awesome, what's this? So this was two things. The first one was a recognition, like I said before, about these tiny, tiny little communities around Europe, that have sort of 100, 300, 500 community members, young black women who go running, or young Muslim women who go hiking or biking, or these tiny communities, you never find them. They need support. They need support, right? Because they're doing it on the side hustle, right? We're all doing side hustles. It's a hobby. Those things die really quickly. You get busy, someone gets sick in your family, you go on holiday, the whole thing falls apart. So business acumen, training, funding, that's what they need. So they can grow them. So they become a movement type of stuff. And on the other side, super interesting on the brand side, the commitment was, it gets super awkward when someone trolls on Patagonia on their social. So if Patagonia wants to be more inclusive, which, that alone is hard, then someone trolls, someone does that whole like White Lives Matter thing, and then Patagonia's junior social media manager is like, I don't know what to do, so they do nothing. They just leave it there or they delete it because they don't know what to do. They haven't been trained. It's awkward, right? No one wants to start a big debate about something so small. So what we said is, hey, what about if that happens to Patagonia? The North Face social media manager chimes in, and the Vio Barefoot community manager chimes in. So all the brands come together to basically shift the conversation, remind people on the internet that this is a community, but no longer a closed community that no one else is into. It's an open community and we support each other. We said, it's not so much about what you say, because no one really knows how to say that. Like if someone comes up to me and shouts at me, I don't really know what to say apart from shout back. But if we just have friends around us and say, open up the conversation, it changes things. So those are the two recommendations: support those tiny communities and make a social media pledge against anti-racism. And then we had to brand it. So they said, now you've inspired it with the strategy, we figured out what to do, turn this into a thing. So we then branded it. We thought what would be nice to do would be to give something slightly different in the outdoor world, because it's like Paris, the original strategist. He said, what if it was like Afro-punk? So you've got the punk scene, and it's kind of like historically, like people think about it as a white sort of musical genre. It's not necessarily true, but it's just how it has. Now, Afro-punk isn't just inviting black people into punk, because that's kind of like, yeah, it's cool, it's cute, it's not really very cool. It's more like it's its own scene within punk. It's like even cooler than punk. It's like Afro-punk. And I was like, oh, that's wicked. So she said, maybe this should be like the Afro-punk of the outdoor world. You know, you've got all the sensible brands and you've got Alto. So we created it to look a bit Afro-punk and look a bit different. And we launched the foundation this year. We got 24 brands and organizations. The brands were important because they need to represent the money and the funding. We're giving out loans and, grants. And the organization is actually even more important because, again, the outdoors is a organization-led community, right? You know, you've got the sort of this association and that association. And if those associations and institutions across Europe don't embrace it, then it will just die. It will have a sort of superficial effect. And then, you know, went back to Phil, who's now the president of Alto. So he went from being an interviewee to being the president of Alto with support from the brand. And for him, he's like, this is mad. You know, I've been in this scene for like 30, 40 years, talking about it as the only guy. And now suddenly the whole industry's embraced it. And that is the biggest effort we've had across Europe. And we've managed to support these organizations. One of them is called We Go Outside, run by Marlon, which is about hiking. Another one is from Mary, which is United We Climb, encouraging climbing. Another one is from Maron, which is the Muslim hikers. Again, images that maybe you're familiar with, but I hadn't seen things like this before. I don't know why, it just looks different. This one, the Black Trail Runners, which is a beautiful organization in the UK. Yvette from Wave Haynes, which is learning surfing. This one's all about all the elements, so all the different things, and getting different people into those scenes. And this one's from Frit, which is actually a photographer and videographer who's actually just creating a lot of the imagery that doesn't exist, and the brands don't know how to do the imagery because they're not from those communities, so supporting him as well. And so it's a really nice story, you know. So Patagonia, like I said, were the original brand that got involved, and then we sort of outsourced it, and all the brands eventually became funders and supporters. And the cool thing about it is, like I said, it went from being a research piece, qual, based on a gut feeling from a strategist, to then sort of getting a bit of a momentum because of Black Lives Matter. So thankfully, good things came out of that. To having this sort of unusual sort of side road of them open sourcing it. That was the crazy thing that Patagonia did, which really gave this a boost, you know, the brand going from like, this is mine, to like, sod it, it's everybody's. And then, of course, we all had to have a lot of patience, you know, which was the hard bit. Like, will they, won't they? For a year, you know, it's like, how are you guys getting on? No, we're just not quite there yet. We're still committed. It's like, how many times have we heard that? Like, it's like, Jesus, how long can it take, you know, to make a decision with about 10 people in a room? And they're like, it takes a long time for like 10 brands to do something together for the first time ever. And so I'm really proud to hear this. You know, with Alto, we are greater than the sum of our parts. We're changing the outdoor world around us, but also transforming us as brands for the better. And I hasten to add that transforming brands for the better is not just a purpose statement. These guys are tapping into new markets. You know, the more you represent the outdoors, a tiny industry in relative terms, to more people, the more it will grow. And, you know, at some point, you can't just have vertical growth, you have to have horizontal growth. So kind of cool. So yeah, that's Alto, and really nice story of data and diversity and inclusion.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, man.
For your presentation. A quick question for you. I mean, this beautiful project was about the outdoor industry. But thinking there are people in the room at home that maybe work on different industries, different vertical. What's the biggest takeaway for you from this project that could be also applied to other industries, other product categories, to make them more inclusive?
I think the biggest learning, and it came in a bit of a scrappy way, if I'm honest, because it happened while we were in the sort of heavy part of Black Lives Matter, where if you were black or brown, everyone was very emotional and like you wanted to fight everybody, even if there was no reason to fight. It's just a moment like that. And we were talking to Patagonia about it, and I realized that it was going to take two paths. It was either going to be a Black Lives Matter reaction for a brand and fall into the CSR brand side of things, I'm like, oh, that's going to be so irrelevant to their business and their, their sort of priorities. It will die as soon as the momentum of Black Lives Matter dies, like any social movement, like 6 months max. Or it could be part of their business priorities. And so we're having this sort of like very heated conversation. I suddenly realized, like, if it's not part of their business priority, then it's dead in 6 months. And so just trying to realize that, that was the angle. Talking to the heart was going to get a lot of, no one's ever going to say no to that, right? You're going to, as soon as you leave the room, it's like next topic, next meeting, next. Someone's got to grow a brand after all. And so realizing that diversity inclusion drives growth. It sounds so obvious when you want to say it all the time because it sounds clever, but actually realizing you could do it was the real sort of difference. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. Another round of applause.
Thank you.